Greetings, and welcome to Movie Recap Vault. In this session, we're presenting a recap of the 2012 action, drama, and sci-fi movie Looper. Joe is waiting to assassinate whoever appears in front of him in a Kansas cornfield. He works for a criminal organization that has told him where a time traveler will appear. It's the year 2044 and time travel hasn't been invented yet. However, in 30 years, 2074, time travel will be invented and quickly outlawed. Although time travel is illegal in 2074, it's the only way to dispose of victims without someone finding them. Joe is a looper. He kills time travelers from 30 years in the future. He knows that soon he'll be paid in gold bars to assassinate his future self, so the criminal organization can erase all records of his assassinations for them. They close the loop. And, time travelers have only 30 more years to live. The time traveler victims always appear with their head covered, and their hands tied behind their backs, with silver or gold bars on their backs for payment. After Joe shoots the people, he incinerates the bodies to erase all records. Joe likes to visit a rural diner after his assassinations. He's trying to learn the French language, and practices with his friendly waitress, Beatrix. Joe gets ready for a night at his favorite club. Joe meets his friend Seth, also a looper, and they drive to the club. They enter the club from the back and Joe tries to find his friend Susie, who works there. She lets a disappointed Joe know she's not available, she's already been reserved by another man. Joe is called to another part of the club, where a group of loopers are gathered. The loopers wonder how Zach is going to react to having his loop closed. Zach takes the news well, and they all celebrate. The next morning Joe gets his notice for an assassination. For multiple days the routine is the same. Joe continues to collect more silver bars. One night Joe investigates a knock on his second-floor apartment window. Seth enters Joe's apartment and is panicked. He confides in Joe that Seth's future self, old Seth, appeared in front of him. He recognized the tune the person was humming, and removed the man's head cover and gag. Old Seth told him that a future boss called the Rainmaker was closing all of the loops. Seth tells Joe that after he untied old Seth, the man ran away, and now Seth doesn't know what to do. However, he thinks their boss, Abe, will send his men to kill him and old Seth. Joe hears a knock on his door, and checks the camera monitor. It's Abe's men, looking for Seth. Seth begs Joe for help, and Joe lets him hide in Joe's underfloor vault. Joe lets Kid Blue, one of Abe's men, and his crew enter. They quickly check the apartment for Seth, and take Joe to see Abe. Abe's office is in the basement of the club that Joe frequents. Abe is from the future, and was sent to Kansas City on a one-way ticket by organized crime, to handle their business. Abe plans to take half of the silver bars Joe has been saving, if Joe doesn't tell him where Seth is hiding. Joe eventually tells Abe that Seth is in his vault, and gives him the combination. Abe thanks Joe, and tells him to spend some free time in the club, while his crew takes care of Seth. Old Seth sees a message etched into his forearm, telling him where to go. As he goes to the meeting his body parts start disappearing. When he finally reaches the meeting place, he's killed, and we discover Seth has been killed as well. The viewer may assume that Seth's body parts were being removed, as old Seth was going to the meeting. Meanwhile, Joe is spending the free time Abe gave him, with Susie. Joe confides in Susie that he let Seth be killed over silver. He tells Susie he's going to give her half of the silver bars he's been saving for years, so she can properly raise her child. Susie doesn't want his money. She only wants to continue giving him services. When Joe returns to his apartment he notices blood in his vault and assumes Seth was killed. The next morning Joe returns to the cornfield killing area to continue his assassination work. Unlike all past jobs, the time-traveling victim doesn't appear when expected. Joe gets anxious. The victim then appears, but his head is not covered, and he isn't gagged. Joe's startled, as the victim quickly turns his back on Joe as Joe shoots him. The gold bars on the man's back fall away, and the man quickly recovers and throws a gold bar at Joe, then knocks him out. When Joe recovers, he finds a note telling him to hop a train out of town, run. Joe realizes that the time traveler was his future self, old Joe. Joe smashes his cell phone so he can't be tracked, and returns to his apartment for his silver bars. He fights with Kid Blue and other members of Abe's crew, and then flees. The movie then shifts to an alternate timeline progression. Back at the scene where old Joe appears, this time old Joe has a head covering and is gagged. After Joe shoots him, he discovers the gold bars and knows his loop has been closed and he now has only 30 years to live. Joe moves to Shanghai and lives a life of luxury for many years. During that time he develops a drug addiction and runs out of money. He then becomes a hitman and continues until one day he meets a lady he falls in love with, and marries. She helps him overcome his problems and he stops being a hitman. In 2074 Joe's 30 years expired, and he's now Old Joe. A crew arrives to capture Old Joe, and in the process his wife is killed. Old Joe's electrocuted and taken to the time travel machine. Old Joe removes his hand restraints and overpowers his captors. He looks at a picture of his wife and forms a plan to change the past so his wife won't be killed. He gets into the time travel machine without a head cover. Joe is startled when someone appears without a head cover. Old Joe attacks Joe, leaves him a note, and takes his truck. Old Joe envisions fuzzy memories of smashing his phone, that he realizes are actions Joe is currently doing. Old Joe goes to the alley outside of Joe's apartment, because he knows that's where Joe is going. Old Joe kills one of Abe's men outside in an alley, and another one that is shooting at Joe as he climbs down the fire escape ladder. Old Joe rescues a knocked out Joe and leaves him in an abandoned lot away from his apartment. Old Joe then escapes the area looking for a library to do some research. Meanwhile, Abe and his crew are now very eager to capture Joe and Old Joe. Abe knows that every moment both Joe and Old Joe are alive, history for others may be altered. Joe regains consciousness from his fall, and wonders how he can find Old Joe. Meanwhile, Old Joe found a library and the addresses and a map of where the 3 people born on the same day as the Rainmaker currently live. The next day, Old Joe cautiously checks the outside of the rural diner he went to in the past, before entering. Inside, he sees Joe. Old Joe compliments Joe on finding a way to send him a message. He sarcastically adds that Joe didn't need to cut the name of Beatrix into his forearm, so it would appear on his forearm, when Jen works at the same diner on the weekends. Old Joe tells Joe that one thing he knows is that Joe is going to meet his wife. Old Joe tells Joe that he wants to kill the 3 people that were born in a hospital on the same day that the Rainmaker was born. That way, he'll make sure that the Rainmaker never becomes the person he is in 2074, and Old Joe's wife will still be alive. He tells Joe about the Rainmaker appearing in Shanghai and within 6 months had control of 5 major crime syndicates. He held mass executions and purged vagrants. And, he did it by himself. Joe tells Old Joe that killing the Rainmaker doesn't concern him. If Old Joe shows him a picture of his wife, he'll know to walk away as soon as he sees her and won't marry her. Old Joe gets angry and attacks Joe. During their fight, Joe rips off part of the map, listing the 3 possible Rainmaker people. Suddenly, Abe's men enter the diner and also start shooting. Old Joe jumps through a window and runs into the cornfield. Joe and Abe's men follow outside where Kid Blue is waiting. When Old Joe is gone, they start chasing Joe. Joe escapes into the cornfield on a motorcycle. He decides to go to the address on the piece of the map he got from Old Joe. The address is for a farm where sees what may be a vagrant on the edge of her cornfield. It's Joe and he hides deeper in the field as Sarah approaches. Sarah tells the person hiding to leave, or she'll shoot. That evening Sarah goes to her barn to turn off a light and hears someone coming out of the cornfield. She backs up, she's scared, and threatens to shoot the person. Joe sees the person and tries to help Sarah. Sarah fires a shot in the air, but then falls. Her son, Sid, hears the commotion from his bedroom and looks out of the window. Joe rushes to Sarah just as the person comes into view. It's a harmless mute vagrant. Joe collapses to the ground, and begs for water. Sarah leaves and soon after Sid arrives and shares his water bottle. Sarah returns to Joe on the porch, and brings Sid inside. She tells Sid that Joe is a sick vagrant. Meanwhile, Old Joe is hiding in a sewer culvert, as Abe's men scour the city looking for him and Joe. Old Joe is focused on his wife and the day they met. Back on the farm, Joe wakes in the barn. He's handcuffed to a cot. Sid briefly visits the barn, sees Joe, and soon after tells Sarah that Joe is awake. Sarah discovers Joe has dragged the cot out of the barn and is cleaning his weapon. Sarah tells Joe to drop his weapon and to leave her property. She throws him a key so he can remove the handcuffs. Joe tells her he can't leave yet. Sarah threatens to shoot him, but Joe doesn't believe she will. Joe shows Sarah the piece of the map he got from Old Joe, and asks her if that's her address. Sarah is stunned by the numbers on the map and asks where they came from. She then shoots Joe. Meanwhile, Old Joe feels the pain from the shot, and uncovers the scar from the wound. Back at the farm, Sarah threatens to shoot Joe in the face with her rock salt cartridges, if he doesn't answer her questions. Joe then explains that although time travel hasn't been invented yet in 2044, in 30 years, it will be used by big criminal organizations. Sarah realizes Joe is a looper. Joe tells her the map had 3 addresses marked on it, and her address was one of them. And he thinks old Joe will kill the child at all 3 addresses to make sure that he kills the Rainmaker. Old Joe thinks if the Rainmaker is dead, old Joe would never have been sent back to 2044, and he'd vanish, and be reunited with his wife. Meanwhile, old Joe kills the first of the 3 children. He's overwhelmed with sadness afterward, and can only think of his wife. Back in the barn, Sarah explains what the numbers mean. The numbers on the left are Sid's birthday, and the numbers on the right are the code for the hospital he was born in. Sarah asks Joe if he'll stop old Joe, and Joe promises he will. Sarah tells Joe to do what he must to prepare for old Joe coming, but don't talk with Sid. Joe tells Sarah they need a way to communicate when he's outside and she's inside. Sarah will check what's available. When Sarah goes inside, she tells Sid he must stay away from Joe. That night, Sid approaches Joe on the porch, and has him come into the kitchen. The two talk while Sid works on his battery-powered toys. Sid tells Joe he's building communications. Sid believes Sarah is not his real mother, and his real mother died. Meanwhile in Kansas City, Abe's men report they saw old Joe leaving a sewer tunnel and chased him. Old Joe got away. Joe tells Sarah that Sid doesn't think she's his real mother. Sarah tells Joe that she was 22 when Sid was born, and regretfully stayed in the city while her sister raised Sid on the farm. Sid called her sister Mom. Sarah moved back to the farm after her sister died. While Sid and Sarah are doing a math game, Sid gets angry at Sarah. He loses control and yells. Sarah is scared of his powers, and flees to the safe in her closet. After Sid has become calm, Sarah returns to his bedroom. Sid apologizes to Sarah. Meanwhile, old Joe is searching for the second person on his map. When he arrives at the address, he realizes that Susie from the club is the mother of the child. Back on the farm, Sarah comes downstairs to answer a knock on the door. One of Abe's men, we later know as Jesse, comes in and shows Sarah pictures of Joe and old Joe. He tells her that he's a deputized officer, and the 2 men are criminals he's looking for. Jesse asks Sarah questions about Sid and her husband, while Joe hides behind the couch and Sid is on the stairs. Sid comes downstairs as Jesse has his back to him. Jesse asks Sarah to show him upstairs. Suddenly, Jesse hears a noise in the kitchen and rushes to investigate. Sid exits the kitchen using a different path, and Sid and Joe use a passage under the stairs to a tunnel leading into a field near the house. Joe and Sid chat while watching the house from a tunnel entrance. Joe tells Sid that Jesse had worked with him, and he won't harm Sid's mother. Sid tells Joe that he's not going to let Sarah get killed. They notice Jesse leave the house, and they both crawl out of the tunnel. That night, Sarah is lying in her bed and decides to send Joe a signal that she needs him, using the toy frog device that Sid made. When Joe arrives in her room, Sarah kisses him and they fall on the bed together. Later, Sarah lets Joe know that she realizes the man coming to the farm to kill Sid is his Loop. However, she still believes Joe will kill him and protect her and Sid. The next morning Joe wakes in Sarah's bed and goes downstairs. Jesse is standing behind Sarah, holding a gun to her head. Joe asks Jesse to let Sarah sit on the couch, and approaches Jesse. Joe lets Jesse know that old Joe is coming to the farm, and he'll kill him and close the loop. Jesse tells Joe that he wants him to get in his truck, and for both of them to go and see Abe. Suddenly, Jesse is startled when he sees Sid on the stairs, and points his gun at Sid. Sid is scared, and starts to fall down the stairs. Suddenly, furniture in the room begins to shake and levitate. Sarah is scared and pushes Joe out of the house. Sid screams while looking angrily at a levitated Jesse. Debris flies out of the door and windows. Meanwhile, old Joe enters Susie's apartment, looking for her child. Old Joe enters the child's bedroom, turns the light on, and is shot with a taser by Kid Blue. Back at the farm, Joe and Sarah recover from Sid's violent episode. They rush inside and don't find Sid, but from the sprayed blood outside of the blown-out windows, Jesse probably is not alive. Joe finds Sid in the cornfield. He's scared and his face is covered in blood. Sarah arrives and comforts Sid. Joe tells Sarah she needs to pack all the items she's taking with her into his truck, and leave within 15 minutes. Joe believes old Joe and Abe's crew are coming to the farm. Meanwhile, Kid Blue arrives at Abe's office area with old Joe. Old Joe suddenly overpowers Kid Blue. He shoots Kid Blue in the foot, takes his handgun, and shoots everyone else in sight. Then, old Joe uses 2 machine guns and grenades to kill everyone he sees on his way to Abe's office. Minutes later, Kid Blue recovers, and decides to go to the farm. Back at the farm, Joe walks onto the road to confront whoever is diving toward him. Old Joe gets out of the vehicle, and lets Joe know he took care of Abe and his crew, and they won't be coming after him. Suddenly, Kid Blue appears on a motorcycle, and knocks Joe to the ground. Joe shoots Kid Blue when he returns shooting toward Joe. Joe recuperates, and realizes old Joe has left the area. Meanwhile, Sarah and Sid are driving away from the farm when they see old Joe walking toward them. He shoots at the truck, and a scared Sid causes the truck to flip over. Sarah and Sid run from the truck and old Joe. Old Joe shoots at Sid and the bullet grazes Sid's cheek. Sid recovers in a rage. He levitates old Joe and Sarah, and knocks old Joe's handgun to the ground. Joe's vehicle is flipped over by the forceful winds that Sid created. Sarah tells Sid that she loves him, calm down, and it will be okay. Suddenly, the winds stop and Sarah and old Joe fall to the ground. Sarah and Sid embrace, and Sarah tells Sid he did good, and he now needs to run. Old Joe tells Sarah to move, as she blocks his line of sight to shoot Sid. Joe finally realizes that if old Joe shoots Sarah, Sid will become the brutal and vindictive Rainmaker. Therefore, Joe shoots himself. Joe falls to the ground, old Joe disappears, and Sid and Sarah hug. Sarah tells Sid that Joe had to go away. Sarah cleans Sid's wounds and puts him to bed. She then visits Joe lying dead in the field, near the gold bars that spilled from his vehicle. The end. Please subscribe and like the video if you'd like to see more. Thanks.